The occult researcher caught archivist Miriam with a smoldering page between her fingers. Miriam tried to fold the burned edge beneath her palm. Ash fell onto the slate floor. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw. He reached, lifted the page, and read a single, concrete line that stopped him. A ledger entry labeling a household as scheduled replacement. That sentence made the problem plain. Miriam's hands were shaking when she met his gaze. He did not wait for explanation. Miriam, the researcher, voice low, "What is that?" He kept his hands visible and his left fingers on the leather of his satchel where the field journal rested. The cold iron scent of the archive, old glue, charred vellum, and incense sat between them as a factual detail the listener could imagine. He knew the room. The Hidden Order archive, late night, a single lamp, rows of catalogued boxes. He knew Miriam by years of minor favors and quiet exchanges. She was the woman who catalogued forbidden folios and muttered page numbers like prayers. Now she had something she hid. Miriam made a weak attempt at a smile. "I burned what I had to," she said. "It was impossible to leave." "Impossible how?" The researcher. His voice held suspicion but not accusation. He leaned forward and read the marginalia. The fragment named not just a theory but listed dates and names in a painstaking hand. Within 5 minutes, an argument had turned into confrontation. Jonas, an acolyte the researcher had met once at a burial rite, barged into the archive antechamber with a sealed scrap rolled in oilcloth. Miriam stole this. Jonas, stamping the scrap onto the table. He spoke quickly. "You burned the ledger, Miriam." "You signed us for a breach, Jonas." Miriam answered, fists tightening. "I burned what I had to keep the ledger from being stolen by their patrons." You know that her fingers scraped the lip of a drawer. She pushed papers aside like a person clearing a path. Jonas dropped the oilcloth and stepped back. The researcher watched both of them. He catalogued facts. Jonas's boots scuffed the floor in exact parallel marks. Miriam's hair had smudges of ash along the temple. He kept suspicion as a tool. It demanded that he cross, check, confirm, then act. He read the scrap Jonas laid down. It contained a sealed warning. A stamped seal, a terse phrase in the order's red hand, and a tiny schematic of a cradle and 2 small notes about effigy alignment. The note was concrete and bureaucratic in tone, not rhetorical. The researcher felt the air change in the room, but described it as the way people rearranged themselves when a truth appeared. Explain effigy alignment. The researcher. His speech was measured. He steepled his fingers when he finished. A habitual motion to steady conversation. It is protocol. Jonas, a preservation protocol. We keep the spark. We do not save the body. He refused to look at Miriam. Jonas. Miriam snapped. "You knew this would get out. You knew. Do not make me explain to you again." He cut in. "Miriam, why burn the page? Why hide it?" His tone moved from accusation to urgent demand. The researcher put both palms flat on the table and pushed the sealed scrap toward Miriam and Jonas. "You me once, Jonas, that the order values evidence. What does this ledger schedule?" The researcher did not let the question hang as a rhetorical device. He insisted on the ledger's concrete content. Jonas exhaled and named locations listed on the scrap. He read them aloud: an outlying farming household, a mid-town watchman, an old woman who taught children to read. Each name and address made the stakes visible. The researcher heard the syllables as if tracing the ledger with his finger. "Scheduled replacement," he said. "That is a timetable." His suspicion shifted into worry as the meaning solidified. They worked into the night, circling the lamp. Around candles on a low table, the researcher, Miriam, and Jonas began to piece fragments together. The researcher traced the ritual schematic with a stub of charcoal. Cradles, dissolving diagrams, the juxtaposition of living forms and contrived effigies. He followed a neat row of circles on the diagram. The repeated marks suggested a process, not a one-off rite. Miriam's voice stayed near the lamp's glow. "Look here, Miriam," tapping a smudge that resembled a cog. "This is not purely symbolic. They annotate machinery." Her finger left a clean smear. "They annotated dates, households, and apparatus. Jonas, this is institutional." His words were short, as if speaking in measured lines helped him hold panic at bay. Their hands moved. Jonas unfolded a ledger. Miriam fed a candle a thread of wax. The researcher set down his journal and circled marginalia with the tip of his pen. They were all performing tasks to keep conversation functional and precise. The researcher specific questions about ink composition and page sources, not about motives. Each answer tightened a knot. The fragments pointed to a program by the order to replace living people with engineered effigies. Where suspicion had lived as a hint, it now became a problem that demanded evidence. Early the next morning they traveled to the shrine where the fragments had come from. The researcher rode with Miriam clutching the scorched page in a cloth wrap. Jonas walked ahead. They kept to secondary streets to avoid watchers. The researcher catalogued small physical details. Jonas's shoulders pulled inward when a carriage passed, Miriam's jaw set against a persistent H. The approach to the cavernous ritual shrine was literal, stone steps cut into damp earth, a rusted iron gate half closed. They arrived during a midnight vigil that had spilled into pre-dawn. Elder Simeon stood at the center of the shrine like a conductor. Attendants moved with practiced motions. A polished effigy lay half covered on an altar. The researcher crouched where shadow and torchlight met. He kept his breathing even and his speech measured in whispers. He watched the attendants assemble the effigy, their hands placing small plates and winding cords. The researcher kept using suspicion as an instrument. He catalogued the effigy's seams, the attendants' roles, the placement of iron pins. He whispered to Miriam that effigy is not ornamental. She nodded. It hums when you touch the metal. It is a machine wrapped in prayer. Miriam's fingers brushed the edge of a ritual cloth and hesitated. Jonas had positioned himself near a rear entrance, where he could see the guardians. He mouthed a terse update to the researcher. 3 guardians with crossbows, 2 with short swords, 1 with a small bell. The researcher set his shoulder against a cold pillar and instructed Miriam through a low line. We watch, we record, we do not engage unless we must. His voice was the same controlled cadence he used in the archive. He wanted to keep the study observational. His actions measured what steps to take next. The vigil shifted. A human subject was brought forward on a pallet. The researcher identified the subject by a patterned shawl and the way the subject's fingers clutched at cloth. Concrete markers, not metaphors. Elder Simon intoned a litany that had no poetry, only steps and recitations. The attendants fed siphons and small glinting vials into a basin device. When the rite began, the researcher moved to intervene. He stepped down from his hiding place and reached across a low divider. Jonas was suddenly between him and the pallet. Jonas, the researcher hissed. Move. We stop this, the researcher reached with both hands. No, Jonas allowed, pressing his shoulder. His voice cracked. Not here. Not now. The researcher felt the weight of Jonas's body as a physical block. The subject convulsed. Flesh split at the seams as if dissolving into a viscous amber. An ember of something lifted and pulsed like a trapped moth. The researcher tried to lunge forward and grab the sleeper's wrist. 3 attendants shoved him back with wooden staves. He twisted, slammed into stone, and tasted iron in his mouth as a cut on his lip met the grit of the floor. He heard the attendants chant in mechanical cadence. He saw the contrived effigy on the altar accept a slow condensation of light and matter that swirled into its hollow chest. Miriam shouted, "Jonas!" Her sound was a physical thing, immediate and raw. Stop him. Stop this! She grabbed at Jonas's sleeve and found himself immovable. Jonas's eyes were flat, his jaw worked. Miriam, Jonas, they promised protection. They promised order. We are necessary. His words were short, but they carried an explanation that unmade trust. The researcher felt betrayal as a shift. Suspicion had become fear, and fear became betrayal. He slammed his fist into the stone. Jonas, he said, voice hoarse, you sanctioned this. Jonas flinched and then answered, I convinced them to spare those on the lists. This is how we hold the balance. His hands opened and closed like a man showing the mechanics of an iron trap. The congregation accepted the replacement without audible question. No one protested as the subject's body thinned and evaporated into that small ember, which the effigy then claimed. The researcher felt the physical thud of the altar's lid as attendants secured it. He heard footsteps at the corridor where the guardians began to converge on their position. He quickly thought in concrete steps. Retreat, preserve, warn. He grabbed Miriam's wrist. Outside, alarms clacked. The corridor filled with men shouting orders. In the confusion, Jonas shoved Miriam and the researcher away from a side door and threw a lantern into a brazier. He blocked the exit with his body. Go. Take what you can! He barked. If you run with nothing, run clean. His face had the look of someone who had decided what to save. On the run to the safe house, their voices were clipped by wind and fear. "Why did you block us?" Miriam demanded as they ducked into a narrow lane. "Jonas, why?" Jonas kept moving his feet fast, "To stop you from becoming cannon fodder for the council, to keep the order intact. Do you think I wanted this?" His answers arrived as single-sentence statements. They reached a safe house and slammed the door. The researcher spread the scorched fragment on a table and breathed in measured counts. He realized the fragment still bore timetable annotations in tiny script. Dates, times of day, household names. The list read like a municipal ledger. The researcher pointed at a line and read it aloud. March 9th. Old Lenora's cottage, South Ridge, replacement scheduled at dawn. He pushed the phrase into Miriam's hands. Miriam's reaction changed again. Suspicion gave way to focused resolve, then to urgent grief. She ran her thumb along the scorch and then said, "We warn Lenora." "We warn them all." Her voice shook, but she spoke decisively. The researcher recorded the page into his journal. His hand shook only when he dipped the pen into ink. He narrated what he'd seen into the journal in short, clinical lines, but his hands trembled when he wrote Elder Simeon's name. They tried to translate marginalia quickly. The researcher read aloud notes about the ritual schematic, cradle positioning, effigy coils, the exact strike needed to initiate unbinding. Jonas, breathing ragged, said, "They scheduled communities, they alternate cycles. It is managed." Jonas placed his palms flat on the table as if to prove the ledger's reality. Miriam shushed him and asked about one notation, a symbol that repeated. She traced the symbol with a fingertip and froze when the line matched a seal she'd once seen in the Order's inner charter. The researcher stepped to the window and looked at the city. Dawn broke silver at the horizon. Pigeons rose from eaves in distinct clusters. He did not use metaphors for the light. He checked the list against municipal records stored in his satchel and confirmed several names. The immediacy of the threat moved his decisions. He would not expose the Order tonight without more evidence, but he could warn Lenora. He Miriam to contact one cautious ally and to hold the ledger page only in her trusted hands. They argued about next steps. Expose them now. Miriam insisted, voice tight, go public with the ledger. Jonas shot back. Expose them and we are all marked. You will ruin every safe channel. You will give them reason to accelerate. The researcher listened, weighing both arguments as tactical choices rather than grand pronouncements. He knew the ledger alone would not sway a council. It would, however, save individual lives if used precisely. They chose a middle course. Rescue where possible, gather more fragments, and build an incontrovertible chain of custody. Miriam would contact an old friend who ran a rural courier network. Jonas would send a shadow to Lenora's cottage with a warning under the guise of a pest control visit. The researcher would follow the shrine lead deeper and attempt to photograph the effigy runs. Each decision was concrete and operational. In the safe house library they worked until the sky paled fully and the city resumed its ordinary cadence. Every 3 or 4 paragraphs of their planning brought a new external event. A footfall at the door, a cough in the stairwell, a slow knock that made them freeze. Each interruption forced them to adjust and to take immediate physical actions, hide the ledger, check corners, move the fragment into Miriam's stitch-bound packet. A minor twist occurred before they left. The researcher decoded a marginal note that named a second shrine, not listed on the original scrap. That revelation altered their map and created a new urgency. Miriam looked up from the page and spoke in a clipped sentence. "This is not a single ritual site. It's a network." The researcher felt that the revelation changed their immediate priorities. He packed his field journal with the careful economy of someone who understood weight and space. They split the remaining evidence. Jonas argued and lost. He wanted full control of the ledger, but Miriam and the researcher both insisted on distributed custody. Miriam stored the scorched fragment in a small leaded case inside her cloak. Jonas agreed with a single curt nod and then left, claiming other duties. The researcher watched Jonas go and felt the shape of trust fracture along an exact seam. At dawn, the researcher climbed to a rooftop overlooking the city with the scorched page burned into a stiff, black crease. He set a small recording blade to transcribe the night's events in tight, unemotional sentences. He spoke as one would file a report, times, names, actions, and outcomes. He described the altar procedure, Elder Simeon's pattern, and Jonas's interference as precise facts. When he finished, He did not write a grand reflection. He closed the journal with a slow, deliberate motion. He placed the fragment in his satchel beside the obsidian amulet and the long wool cloak. He checked the satchel strap, set his spectacles in his coat pocket, and adjusted his cloak, the final concrete beat. He rose, pulled the hood over his head, and stepped down from the rooftop toward the stair that led to the river road. He moved toward the next lead with measured steps, the scorched ledger secure, and the timetable now a list of people he would try to warn. The city noise swallowed the sound of his boots as he descended into dawn, and the chapter ended on that action rather than on an abstract statement. A metal arm plunged its needle into the volunteer's sternum, and a pale thread of light lifted from the wound as the occult researcher crouched behind a broken pier. Suspicion had driven him into the archives undercroft, the suspicion that texts and rituals here treated human life as replaceable. He had not expected to witness a harvest. He had expected papers and argument. The central problem became visible in an instant. A living spark was being extracted to seed a manufactured replica. He moved his hand to steady the field journal at his belt and kept his face low. The shrine smelled of wet iron and burnt wax. An initiate tightened a leather strap across the volunteer's wrists while a second struck a metal disc that hummed under the effigy's arm. The volunteer, a woman in a plain work tunic, made a sound that broke into a single word. "Please." The occult researcher did not answer aloud. He counted names instead, what he could recall from roster fragments in the vault, and catalogued risk. Exposure would mean arrest, worse. Silence would mean more extractions. Tension pulled at him. Suspicion slid toward alarm when one of the initiates steadied the volunteer's head and whispered, "Now," to the machine. He laced the word into his memory. He had seen archivist Miriam only nights earlier, her fingers holding a smoldering page. Miriam's accusation, caught with a page between her fingers, burned behind his eyes. The memory of her with that scorched leaf made him suspect she knew more than she admitted. The shrine's light came from candles set into iron sconces, and from the faint lumen that the effigy's core produced. The occult researcher kept to shadow and to stone. He watched as the mechanical arm withdrew a filament of light the width of a hair and folded it into a glass vial. A small bell sounded, and an initiate nodded at High Initiate Thaddeus, who stood beneath a carved relief of gears and hands. Thaddeus lifted his chin and recited a line that the occult researcher recorded in shorthand, an invocation that spoke of sanction and provision. Alarm hardened into resolve. The researcher slid a hand into his satchel and felt the cold weight of an obsidian amulet. He listened for the cadence of voices. "Stop this," someone hissed from the antechamber. Archivist Miriam pushing through two acolytes, a smoldering page clutched in one hand. Her arrival split the ceremony like a blade. "Miriam," said acolyte Jonas as he moved to intercept, "you do not enter the sanctum." His voice had a quick edge. He stepped between her and the altar. Her face held soot and lines where contact had scorched the codex. "You burned the page, Thaddeus." He sounded pleased, not angry. "You burned evidence. You are traitor or mad, which is it?" Miriam's reply was not a monologue. She lunged forward and grabbed for the vial the initiates had sealed. "You are stealing flesh and calling it ordained," she said, voice high and controlled. "You call the demiurge's will law and you call it mercy when it is theft." Jonas grabbed her arm. "Jonas, let go," she ordered. He hesitated, fingers tightening, his jaw working. The occult researcher stepped from his hiding place because the room had shifted from observation to clash, and because he could not let Thaddeus claim that vial. He unfolded himself into candlelight and spoke with the low diction he used when addressing a jury of texts. "Give me the page," he said. Now his voice carried calm, but his hands set the journal face down on the stone as if ready to record whatever happened next. Thaddeus looked at him with a slow, measured gaze. "You are not of the order," he said. "You do not command us." He gestured at the effigy. "The demiurge authorized provisional creations. The text permits replacement when a vessel wears thin. We harvest the spark and preserve continuity." He produced a torn fragment and held it up. The paper's edge was blackened. Inked lines ran like small rivers across the fiber. The researcher moved toward it, fingers already working to free it from Thaddeus's grip. Jonas watched the researcher, and something in his posture shifted, uncertainty rippling across his face. Miriam's fingers dug into Jonas's sleeve. "Jonas," she said, Lo, you remember the child in the record. You remember the lullaby, Jonas's hand loosened by a fraction. The researcher read the break in allegiance and seized the chance. He lunged, though not with sword but with speed of reach, and slipped the blackened fragment into his coat. Torches flared as a dozen feet moved to intercept. "Stop him!" Thaddeus shouted. Footsteps pounded through torchlit vault corridors. The researcher ran with the fragment pressed flat against his chest. Behind him, Jonas shouted something, then hesitated between flight and aid. Miriam's voice cracked as she called his name. The researcher pushed through a narrow door and slid along cold stone while acolytes gave chase. He took a right where the corridor forked and turned his shoulder through a lattice of iron grates, knocking a torch loose so that a small fan of sparks fell. A short distance from the sanctum, a chained door banged open and 2 initiates spilled into the corridor. One pursued while the other stayed to pull the wounded volunteer free from straps. The researcher counted choices again. Hide the fragment, examine the text for doctrinal justification, find Miriam. He ducked into a maintenance niche and pressed his back to cool mortar. He listened. He could hear Miriam arguing with Jonas in the distance, her voice taut, Jonas's words softer now, filled with self-reproach. An external event snapped the night. The effigy left in the sanctum convulsed. The glass vial on the altar shivered and tumbled. The room that had been filled with ritual rhythm stuttered. Thaddeus cursed. The researcher heard the word remember pass through the corridor and didn't know yet whether the effigy would recall only pattern or something human. He swallowed and felt the fragment's edge cut the palm through his coat. He ran again. He ran because the fragment in his pocket felt like a live thing, warm and brittle. He had to know what Thaddeus had claimed, that the demiurge had authorized provisional creations. He had to know whether a harvested spark could seed a replacement that carried the previous person's traces. He navigated a map of vaults from memory, rooms where seals were kept, alcoves where codices were catalogued. In a dim service room he halted and forced his breath steady against his ribs. He peeled back the oilskin and flattened the paper. The fragment contained a rule. A bureaucratic clause written in small, exact hand invoking sanction, conditions, and a notation, an official looking sigil that matched the one embroidered along his cloak's hem. The researcher heard a soft sound at the doorway and almost flinched. "You shouldn't burn those pages, Miriam," a voice said from the threshold. He did not look up. He had seen Miriam with a smoldering page before. He knew the cut of her shoulders. "Miriam, Jonas, you could have been killed." Jonas's voice had a rush of fear and a thread of anger now. "Jonas," Miriam replied. "You read the passage. You heard Thaddeus. You remember the child's lullaby in Ledger 7. Tell him what he did to the villagers." Jonas swallowed, and the room shifted around his jawline. The researcher saw the change. Jonas moved from obedient acolyte to someone who had witnessed atrocity. They argued in short blows. Thaddeus claims sanction. Thaddeus claims the demiurge gave them leave to act when matter fails. He uses holy language to excuse theft. Miriam, he uses bureaucracy to strip people of their lives. Each line was a small revelation. The researcher recorded syllables quickly, then asked out loud, "Does the fragment state that replacements inherit recollection?" Miriam's face went pale and then flat. "Not explicitly," she said, "but the effigies carry crafted elements, teeth molds, voice reeds, and in one ordinance a phrase about pattern assimilation." She pushed a hand through her hair, and the smell of charred parchment came again. "I took the page because I couldn't stand to watch them continue without challenge. I did not know they would harvest now." She looked at Jonas. "Jonas, why did you stand with them?" Jonas's hands trembled. He started and stopped. He blinked, then focused. "I stood because I thought it preserved order," he said. "I read the ledger where they listed the replaced. I told myself those taken were old or dying, but the woman tonight," his voice broke, "she was not sick. She laughed in the market last week. I heard her barter for bread." An external event arrived, a distant clank, the sound of Thaddeus's boots. The researcher counted seconds and chose action. He moved to Miriam and Jonas and extended the torn fragment. "Read this to me," he said aloud. He set the journal on a cracked table and opened to a blank page. Jonas hesitated but took the fragment. He read the lines slowly, the voice uneven and then firmer as he adjusted to the script. Clauses that permitted replacement when the demiurge declared provisional status. an annotation that suggested the new effigy be fashioned to fulfill civic roles quickly, a stamp that named an office the custodial provision. While Jonas read, the researcher watched Miriam for a micro-reaction. She swallowed and leaned forward. That stamp, she said, is not just administration. It is a contract sold to guilds. They profit by producing effigies and reducing maintenance on the living. They call it conservancy. Jonas's eyes widened. Conservancy? He asked. His voice shed the last of its obedience. They sell replacement like grain, Miriam. The reader's sense shifted to dread. The researcher felt his suspicion change into a quiet, surgical rage. He plotted. Expose Thaddeus, secure copies, destroy the effigy if it proved able to inherit living traces. He needed proof that the effigy could carry memories tied to a living person. An unexpected sound came through the wall. The effigy in the sanctuary, left alone, produced a wet, mechanical cough, and then projected an image across polished stone. The projection was not a metaphor. Light formed a short scene. A child's small hand at a bedside, Miriam humming a lullaby, the exact cadence Miriam herself had used when she had been recorded years before. The projected image included Miriam's face in a younger shape, the same scar along the brow and the same pale eyes. Jonas staggered back. "Miriam," he said, "is that you?" Miriam's lips made no sound. Her fingers dug into the table edge until knuckles whitened. The effigy continued, emitting a recorded motion that matched the lullaby's rhythm. And then the projection advanced to a moment when a woman closed a worn gate, and the clack of the latch matched Miriam's memory of a childhood morning. The effigy had not merely copied manner, it had spliced a living scene. The researcher recognized the evidence of inheritance, patterns of behavior, recorded gestures, and an image that included the exact scar described in the archivist registers. A small cliffhanger snapped the room. Jonas cried, "They stole her name!" and then spun to run toward the sanctum. The researcher lunged to stop him. "Jonas, stop," he ordered. "If you go now, you will be seen and they'll seal the shrine." "Wait," Jonas's shoulders shook. He froze at the doorway and then turned back, jaw locked with a new decision. This was the mid-chapter pivot. Jonas moved from aid to action and set a new axis for the group's choices. Back in the sanctum, the half-formed effigy convulsed and then, as if reaching, projected another movement. A memory where a voice said, "Do not forget the child in Ledger 7. The voice was Miriam's. Thaddeus met the projection with a strangled laugh. "It remembers lines from ritual practice," he said. It borrows phrases. That proves nothing beyond patterning." The researcher stepped forward. "Thaddeus," he said, "you once claimed replacement was a theological necessity. Now you show evidence it repeats specific private speech. How do you justify theft?" Thaddeus's expression hardened. He produced a small bronze stamp and pressed it into a wax pad. "I justify it by scale," he said, "by numbers, by the practical need to keep institutions running. We cannot shelter every spark indefinitely." The demiurge set the pattern and allowed repair. Miriam cried out, "You speak of institutions while you cut throats." She lunged and the room erupted into the confrontation the researcher had feared. There were 3 rapid exchanges in that argument. "Thaddeus, stop," Miriam snapped. "Miriam, hand over the page." Thaddeus replied. "Jonas, stay with me," the researcher demanded. "Jonas, I will not let you run," the researcher added quickly when Jonas moved. The quick back and forth cracked the ritual's calm and each line revealed motive. Thaddeus invoked duty, Miriam invoked justice, Jonas invoked confusion. In the chaos, the researcher did something he had not planned. He turned to the half-formed effigy and struck its joint with the flat of his journal. The effigy spasmed and projected a blurred image, Miriam's face, clear and surprised, mouthing a single word. "Forgive." The projection then hiccuped and next displayed an image of the volunteer from the opening, smiling in a market stall while handing over a coin. The researcher acted. He tore a strap from his coat and wrapped it around the effigy's core and pulled a shard of glass from an implement case. He pried at a seam while Thaddeus hurled curses and Miriam shouted instructions to Jonas. The effigy bucked and a small cascade of sparks painted the air. Jonas moved to help the researcher, then stopped, hand hovering over the tool. "Jonas, Miriam, if you help him, you break order. If you do not, you break your oath." Jonas's breathing quickened. His choice would alter the moral balance. Jonas chose. He stepped forward and jammed his shoulder against the effigy, holding it still while the researcher worked free a metal plate. The effigy emitted another fragment of projection. A child's hand closing a gate latch, the same motion the projector had shown earlier. The researcher saw a pattern. The effigy had stitched specific private scenes into its program. It did not only simulate, it replayed private life. They stopped the effigy only partially. The device's lights blinked and dimmed but did not die. The room smelled of ozone and burnt fiber. Miriam sank to the floor, trembling. "I did not know," she said. "I burned a page because I thought it would stop them. I did not think they would act tonight." Jonas sat down beside her, knees shaking. "Jonas," the researcher said quietly, "you read to me the fragment. You have seen how they justify it. We have proof the effigies reproduce private life. That proof will expose the custodial provisions crime." Jonas nodded in slow, stunned motion. An aftershock arrived. A distant shout, and then the footfalls of Thaddeus's acolytes retreating through the vaults. The researcher wrapped the fragment in oilskin and tied it tight. He made one terse entry in his field journal, ink quick and careful, and then folded the journal shut. He watched Miriam. She had a hollow look and yet kept her hands steady around her knees. Jonas stood and faced the researcher as if deciding whether to follow him into further risk. The researcher made the choice for them. He slid the oilskin, wrapped fragment into a hidden pocket inside his journal, and pushed the journal deep into his satchel. He found a small length of linen and began wrapping Miriam's wrists where the straps had marked her skin. "You will live to testify," he said. Miriam's mouth trembled and she tried to form words of thanks but only managed a raw exhale. Jonas closed his eyes and ran a hand over his face, fingers catching at his hair. Smoke and candle wax settled. The sanctum smelled of metal and a faint chemical tang where the effigy had overheated. The researcher listened to Miriam tell, in short lines, what she had found in archives months before. A ledger entry listing families whose heads had been replaced, a market list that included a new effigy for the toll house. She repeated a detail from the previous chapter, the smoldering page she had been caught with. Concrete proof that tied her to the earlier memory the researcher had of her in the stacks. Jonas volunteered information in staccato bursts. "Thaddeus sold contracts to keep guild houses operating," he said. "He convinced merchants the cost of living labor is higher than buying a replacement. He convinced the watch to accept effigies for patrol. I read the ledgers. I filed complaints. They vanished. I kept my mouth shut because I was frightened." He rubbed his face. "I thought I was doing the right thing." His voice ended as a thin crack. The researcher put a hand on his shoulder. Outside the vault, the first gray of pre-dawn seeped into narrow vents. The researcher looked at the group and felt the arc of the night close and then widen. He had stopped a single effigy, and in doing so had uncovered a network. He had the torn fragment, Miriam had her testimony, and Jonas had an admission that would fracture loyalty. He recorded each act as a concrete item. The torn fragment sealed, the effigy partially disabled, Miriam's hands bandaged, Jonas's confession written in his journal. He made a final quiet vow, not with words of destiny but with a list of actions. He would trace the custodial provisions contracts through guild ledgers, visit the toll house in daylight to examine patrol rosters, and seek the artisan workshops where effigies were molded. He wrapped the fragment, tucked it beneath the journal's spine, and sealed the bundle with a strip of wax. The room remained cluttered with tools, candles, and a single dying projector lamp. He lifted his satchel. Jonas rose and followed him to the narrow stair. Miriam stayed behind to collect the ruined codices. She held the smoldering page with gloved fingers and passed the researcher a single word that smelled of ash and accusation. Record they left the sanctum in a tight line. The researcher felt suspicion change into a steadier, colder purpose. He had started the night watching a harvest. He would leave it with a list of places to check and people to warn. The last concrete beat of the chapter is a single noise. As they reached the researcher's temporary study, he set the journal on the desk, wrapped the fragment inside its spine, and then heard a footfall on the great archive stair, heavy, deliberate, and coming down toward his door. He burst through the iron, studded door and found a body lifting in pale motes above a carved cradle while a new form stitched itself on the altar. Suspicion drove him there. He had followed a trail of smoldering paper and suppressed ritual notes that smelled of scorched vellum and old iron. He stepped onto cold flagstone, boots clanging, and shouted, "Stop!" The chapel answered with a clatter of chains and the hiss of oil-fed gears. He was the occult researcher. He had spent months cataloguing marginalia and cross, referencing ritual fragments, when archivist Miriam had been caught with a smoldering page in the archive a week earlier. He remembered her hand, blackened at the edges, the page still warm. He remembered the volunteer in the undercroft whose sternum had been pierced by a metal arm, and whose pale thread of light had left the room like a moth. Those two images pushed him into the forge now. Suspicion tightened his jaw and made his hands deliberate. Acolytes surged forward. "Hold him," barked the priory warden, his voice hard and metallic in the chamber. The researcher lunged between the cradle and the altar. Candles burned in iron sconces and shadow cut every corner into a black pool. The new effigy on the altar had a ribbed torso, joints of polished brass, and a face still folding into being. The lifted body above the cradle hung like a cloud of flour, drifting in spirals. Miriam, the researcher, voice flat. "What is this?" Archivist Miriam did not look away from a panel of etched runes. She held a damp cloth to her fingertips where ash had blackened the skin. "Do not touch the circuit," she said. "Do not touch anything." Her voice had a precise calm that had once been comfort, and now read like warning. Acolyte hands found the researcher's arms. He felt the wool of his cloak rip where they jerked him back. He twisted. His shoulder stung. "Let me go," he said. He shoved with his legs and planted both boots on stone. "Miriam, tell me what you were burning in the archive. Tell me why." The warden cut him off. "You should not have come here." "The warden, you have no clearance." "Step away from the altar." His tone held authority and a threat. The warden wore a sleeved surcoat of ash, grey wool and an iron gorget with the priory emblem pressed into the metal. He kept his hand close to a leather-encased instrument at his belt. The researcher did not step back. Suspicion had sharpened into a physical atch behind his ribs. He moved with that ache. He had already seen the prototype diagram hidden under the altar's foundation. He had seen the schematics that treated living organs as replaceable valves and human light as an input. The volunteer in the undercroft had whispered, I was temporary," and the words still scraped the researcher's teeth. Now he stood in the room where a replacement was being made. An acolyte yanked his satchel strap and the satchel swung. Codices thudded against his hip. He heard the rasp of vellum, the faint breath of the volunteer above the cradle, and then the sound that had haunted the archive nights. The demiurge's gears deep under the altar, a low mechanical thrumming like a far-off heart. "Miriam," he said again, "if you burn those papers, you destroy evidence. If you hide the mechanism, you hide what they are doing to people." His speech was clipped, each sentence a concrete demand. Miriam paused. She did not meet his eyes. "You do not understand the cost," she said. "You do not understand the spark." Her fingers moved over a ring of brass pins and the effigy's eyelids fluttered. The warden moved forward and struck the side of the cradle with a staff. The lifted body convulsed. The pale motes collapsed into a slow drift. The effigy on the altar inhaled, if a machine could inhale, and its new hands flexed. The researcher tried to pry free a hand. "Who gave you permission to take people?" he demanded. "Permission is not to the point, the warden. Stability is the point. The sequence must complete." He barked an order and two acolytes tightened their grip. An external bell crashed, copper on metal, from the outer gallery, a signal. A newcomer voice shouted, "Warden, intruders at the gate." That interruption split the room like a cleaver. The warden barked an order and 5 acolytes flowed toward the door. Miriam slipped a small key into a hidden slot beneath the altar and the cradle's carvings clicked. The researcher took the moment. He shoved free, fell forward, and knocked over a brazier. Flame licked a strip of cloth and the room's smell shifted to singed wool. He stumbled down the outer gallery steps and did not stop until he punched into the stair that led to the archive undercroft. He landed on his knees in a narrow corridor, stained with old ink and dust. The undercroft smelled of mildew and iron. A figure rose from the tangle of blankets propped against a pillar. The volunteer. The volunteer's hand trembled where a ritual mark rose pale on the inside of the wrist, an indented circle cut by a fine blade. "You were temporary," the volunteer said before the researcher could speak. The sentence had no plea, it was a statement of fact. The volunteer's eyes were dry. The researcher crouched and pressed his palm to the volunteer's shoulder. "Who you that?" he asked. His hand felt clammy, and his voice carried a quickness that betrayed sudden fear. "Miriam, me," the volunteer said. The researcher looked up. He had not expected Miriam's name to be spoken here. He had expected denials, evasions, calls for mercy. Instead came the blunt clarity of the volunteer's voice. The corridor's single lamp guttered. Miriam entered behind him, boots noiseless, cloak tight against her shoulders. She carried the field journal in one hand and a set of brass keys in the other. "You found them," she said. "You found the Undercroft." Her tone was even. It carried no apology. He was temporary. The researcher, you burned a page in front of the archivists. You arranged the volunteer's extraction. Why, Miriam? Miriam set the journal on a low table and opened to a page filled with tiny notations. "You speak as though I wished this," she said. "I curate what's left. I make choices that keep the spark alive. Sometimes that means removing a body to feed the process." She tapped the page where a single paragraph had been blackened by flame. "Removing a body," the researcher repeated. "Is that how you describe forcing a man into a needle?" "You say forcing," Miriam answered. "They consent when given the reason. They consent when told they are part of a salvage. The Priory frames it as conservation." She closed the journal with a deliberate motion. "You him to accept being disposable," the volunteer said, voice tight. He would be honored." The volunteer's hands found the ritual mark and traced the incised circle. The researcher stared at Miriam. He felt an emotional shift in his chest. Suspicion cracking into fear, fear curdling into anger. He pushed to his feet. "You curated removals," he asked. "You curated people." Miriam's jaw tightened. "We do what we must to keep the spark from dying, and we keep a record. I conserve what I can. I will not let the Priory purge everything at once." Her fingers found the wired corner of the journal, and she stroked the binding like one might check a wound. An external clank sounded. A shutter above the mechanical vault ticked closed. The researcher felt the air change. The mechanized heart stuttered somewhere below. He and Miriam exchanged a look that contained the history of the archive's late nights. Pages passed under candlelight. The night he caught her with ash on her fingers. The metal arm that had plunged into a volunteer's chest. "Show me the shaft," he said. She hesitated and then led him back toward the chapel. They moved in silence for a few stone paces. An acolyte glanced at them and then continued sweeping. They reached the altar's eastern flank where Miriam pressed a panel and iron teeth opened to a narrow shaft. A smell of oil and burnt copper came up from the shaft. Miriam lowered a lantern and threw a rope down. "The machine has been here longer than any of us," she said. "It predates the reforms. They found it sealed in a crypt and we adapted it." He tied the rope and slid down. The vault was a low room of iron ribs and brass canals. A dome of gears filled the ceiling. The demiurge itself crouched beneath the altar. A ribbed dome of bronze and glass with a lattice of pistons and a blunt, faceless head of hammered copper. Panels of schematics lay on a central table, annotated in tiny hand. Miriam leaned over the table and tapped the annotated diagram. "Look," she said, "inputs on this page show living light channeled into forms. The notes record yields and decay. The margin shows dates, centuries of runs. Here they treat a human as a batch number." Her voice did not tremble when she said it, but the researcher watched her hand clench into a white knuckle. He read. The diagrams translated flesh into mechanical nodes. There were rows labeled input, columns titled spark retention, numbers next to lifespans. The language of the schematics made each human a consumable element. He felt another emotional shift, anger cooling into grim comprehension. The system was not an experiment in some abstract sense. It was a production cycle. They designed a process to extract and store what animates us, he said. Miriam pressed her palms to the table. "We have to choose who stays," she said. "I choose. I try to save a spark when the Priory will purge assets." Her eyes landed on him. "I saved documents when others burned them." She swallowed. "This is why I burned the page in the archive that day. I could not bear to let it fall into the wrong hands." Her voice broke for a single, human beat. "You hid the mechanism," he said. "You lock the Undercroft. You control access. You admit it here." He kept his voice steady. "I did," she said, "and when you came barging into the chapel, the lockdown saved what I could. You ruined the sequence, but you saved nothing unless we acted afterwards." She looked at him with a tired clarity. Before he could answer, a metallic grinding rose from the Priory above. The warden's voice came down the shaft. Tight and controlled. Archivist Miriam, your presence is required in the control alcove. The warden's men report a misfeed in the sequence. He did not ask. He commanded. Miriam's shoulders tightened. They will shut the vault if I do not authorize the override, she said. They will purge the list. They will start again and take more lives. I cannot let that happen. Her fingers found a stained switch on the console. Miriam, the researcher, if you lock them out, the warden will call the Priory guards. We will be trapped. We will be marked as traitors. She cut him off. We are already traitors to what they built. Her voice went cold in that sentence. She flicked the switch. The vault door hissed and a heavy latch slammed into place. The demiurge's dome flickered as auxiliary servos took the load. An acolyte banged on the chapel door and shouted that the warden demanded release. The researcher felt his fear spike into urgency. He banged at the vault door from below. Miriam? The warden will bring men with torches and axes. If they breach this chamber, they'll take every page and kill the volunteers. He forced his voice into a command. Miriam kept her hands on the console. Then we have to make a different choice, she said. We take one spark and we keep it. We stop the sequence and ruin the machine. We cannot let them use it as a factory any longer. He considered her words. His mind rolled outward over the months he'd spent reading marginalia, the nights when the archive smelled of wet paper, the time he had seen her with the smoldering page. He remembered the volunteer in the undercroft and the needle that had lifted the thread of light. He felt an emotional shift inside. Desperation into a brittle resolve. If we stop it, he said, we must make sure the spark survives outside the machine. Miriam nodded. I conserve. I kept protocols to cradle a spark without the demiurge. The reliquary holds a chamber to hold ember safely for a length of time. But I cannot do both. I cannot both run the mechanism and cradle the spark. We must choose now. She looked at him with a sudden, human plea. They argued by short lines over the next minutes, their words cutting like chisels. We destroy the mechanism. The researcher. We save a spark, Miriam replied. We cannot save everyone. The researcher. We never could, Miriam. That exchange escalated. Acolytes below the chapel shouted that the warden intended to force a manual override. Footsteps on the stair, boot soles scraping concrete, announced escalation above. The external world had become a pressure valve forcing a decision. The researcher and Miriam moved together through the upper gallery back toward the altar. A new effigy on the table twitched. The cradle's carvings glowed faintly with runic light. The volunteer above the cradle was strapped in by linen bands. His chest rose and fell with a strange rhythm as the motes clustered. A faint thread of pale light lay like a hair over his sternum, curling toward the effigy. Cut the conduit. The researcher. Miriam's mouth compressed. If I cut it, the spark will fritter in the room and be lost. If I complete the sequence, the spark goes into the effigy and we create another living shell. That is not a solution. She had no triumph in her voice, only calculation and grief. The warden and 3 acolytes appeared in the gallery and the Priory emblem flashed under a torch's light. Archivist Miriam, release the control. In the name of the Priory, I order it. He presented a sealed tabard. Step away from the console. Now, Miriam put her hand to the console and then, in a move that surprised him, she turned the key and sealed the control to a local fallback. She pivoted and shouldered the warden. Movement became a collision. The researcher lunged. What followed was a set of rapid, forceful exchanges. 3 to 5 lines of terse, physical dialogue and movement. Miriam, no. The researcher barked as he dove. Get off me! Miriam snapped and shoved him toward the altar. Warden, stop. The researcher, grabbing a strap, stop resisting. The warden, striking at the researcher with the pommel of his staff. Hands closed on wrists. A lamp fell and rolled, flames licking a carved panel. The effigy twitched and a single wire sparked. The volunteer's breath hitched. The Priory men tightened a ring. The vaulted roof shuddered with the noise of men and gears. The researcher aimed for the conduit, where a braided cord fed the demiurge from the volunteer's sternum. He reached and fumbled for it. Miriam battled the warden and 2 acolytes. The altar groaned as the demiurge shuddered under the strain. He gripped the braided cord and brought his knife down. Metal rasped, the cord frayed. Sparks flew and the effigy's newly formed mouth opened, producing an unintelligible sound like a throat clearing. The warden lunged. The researcher shoved the warden off and used the momentum to yank the remaining cord free. The conduit severed. Everything went wrong and then immediate. The demiurge convulsed, gears screamed, a pressure seal popped and a column of oily steam hit the gallery. The effigy shuddered and its joints unlatched. A strand of pale light, thin and bright, broke free from where the volunteer's sternum had bled it and shot upward into the chamber like a wasp. The researcher reached for that strand with both hands, palms open. It passed through his fingers with no heat but a physical jolt that made his muscles contract. It left a residue on his palms like the smell of warm parchment and wet iron. The strand hung for a heartbeat, then uncoiled into a slender ember and slipped sideways, brushing Miriam's cheek as it passed. Miriam grabbed the ember between two fingers and could not suppress a tiny sound, half a cry, half a laugh. She carried it to the reliquary she had kept hidden beneath her cloak. Her hands were steady when she closed the reliquary and latched the lock. The vault screamed as gears tore and metal splintered. Pieces of the effigy fell like carved teeth. The volunteer's body collapsed into a heap on the cradle. The warden staggered back, coughing and holding his hand where oil had sprayed him. Acolytes scrambled over the floor to drag the wreckage clear. Outside, torches flared and there was the sound of 100 boot heels in a narrow courtyard as priory guards rushed to respond. The chapel shook. Dust fell in small clouds. The demiurge juddered once and then went still. They were wounded. The volunteer breathed shallow and then flatlined for a single, terrible second before coughing once, eyes fluttering open. He stared up, pupils dilated, then looked at his hands. He touched the ritual mark and did not shake. He, in a voice hoarse and small, temporary. "You are not disposable, Miriam." Her voice broke and the weight of the room anchored her. "I lied to you about honor. I lied because I thought the alternative, mass purging, was worse. I lied to make choices that preserved one ember rather than losing all." She looked at him and then at the researcher. "We have averted one purge. I took the risk and I accept the consequences." The researcher felt the last emotional shift settle, from suspicion to fear to anger, and then to a quieted, pragmatic grief. He sat on the cold stone and watched Miriam lift a piece of the damaged brass and stroke it with ungloved fingers. "We must record this," he said. "We must document the schematics, the dates, the list of volunteers. We must expose the priory's cycle." Miriam nodded. "I will open the sealed notes. There is a ledger. It names decades and names people, but exposing it will make enemies. The priory will not yield. They will call it heresy. They will claim we destroyed sacred machinery for personal gain." Her voice had an edge. "Even so, I carved what I could from the margins. We will need witnesses. We will need time." She closed the reliquary and wrapped it in oilcloth. Outside the chapel, the warden banged on the door and shouted that they would be tried for sabotage. Men hammered at the wood. The researcher rose and moved to the shaft where the demiurge lay. He picked up one of the schematics and tucked it into his satchel. He looked at Miriam. "You could have let them run it," he said. "I could have," she answered. "I did not." She looked smaller than she had the first night he found her with a smoldering page. "I chose a piece of ember over production. I chose a scrap of life over a score of corpses. I did not choose well. I chose where I could." He reached for her shoulder and the touch was not dramatic. It was the press of an ungloved hand on a sleeve. "We worked together," he said. When the priory men finally forced the chapel doors, they came with torches and legal seals and loud accusations. The warden held a document up and shouted, "You have tampered with a sacred instrument and broken our rights." His men seized the reliquary from Miriam's cloak, but the inner chamber within was protected by the archivist's lock and the seal had not been broken. They could not take the ember. The researcher narrated what he had seen with short, concrete lines. He described the sequence, the extraction, the shaft, the ledger. He produced the smoldered page he had retrieved earlier, the burnt edge of physical proof. He spoke of the volunteer's recent extraction and the needle, the metal arm, the thread of light he'd witnessed in the undercroft the previous week. The priory examined the schematics and then ordered a council. Men with furrows in their brows read the diagrams aloud. An argument took place that was loud and procedural. The warden denounced Miriam and the researcher. Miriam admitted to burning a page but framed it as a preservation to prevent wholesale extermination. Voices rose. Torches flared. The chapter's pace accelerated into administrative violence. The council's decision was not a clean verdict. They could not fully dismantle the demiurge without losing valuable codices and without creating a scandal that would splinter the priory. The warden called for a temporary suspension of the machine with a committee oversight. Miriam deflected immediate punishment by offering a plan: a restricted reliquary program, a public inventory of names, and limited oversight for volunteers. Some called it a compromise. Others called it treason. Men debated into the early hours, but the practicalities of power slowed decisions. The demiurge remained half destroyed on the altar. The reliquary remained sealed in Miriam's satchel. The volunteer lay on a pallet and slept. In the ash-lined antechamber at dawn, the researcher drew the shattered schematics across his knees and wrote. He wrote precise lines of observation. Dates, inputs, the number of cycles, names in the ledger he had glimpsed. He documented Miriam's admission that she had curated removals. He made a measured entry about the ember and how they had saved one spark by severing the conduit. Miriam stood over him and watched the page. "You will publish portions, not everything," she said. "If we burn too much to light the world, the priory will bury us entirely. We must be surgical." Her tone was exact. He placed the page into a sealed envelope and then onto the table. He looked at the volunteer sleeping in a corner of the antechamber and at Miriam's hands, stained with oil and ink. "We did not free everyone," he said. "No." Miriam softly, "We saved one ember. That is all we could manage tonight." He felt neither triumph nor despair. He felt the steady click of decision. Document, preserve, rally allies. He wrote another line in the field journal. A concrete record of choices made and names to call. A knock sounded at the outer door. A young acolyte entered and handed Miriam a folded slip. A messenger at the gate. He says a distant house claims knowledge of an earlier maker. He offers information if we meet discreetly." His eyes darted to the reliquary and then away. Miriam unfolded the slip and read. She looked at the researcher. "They may know how to cradle a spark safely outside the machine," she said. "Or they may be a trap. Either way, we have to respond." He folded the schematics and slid them into his satchel. He stood and checked the reliquary's seal once more. "We contact them," he said. "But first we secure witnesses. We assemble the ledger. We get names to testify that the priory ran cycles without consent. We show the world a list of people they treated as inputs." His voice was a plan. Miriam nodded. "I will open the sealed notes and give you what I can. I will take responsibility for my removals and explain why I did what I did. The priory will punish me, but perhaps my testimony will force reform." She hesitated. "If they break the vault beyond recovery, the machine's logic will remain in memory. It will be written and someone will find it. We must remove the templates." He tapped the page he had just written, then remove the templates. "Burn what would let them reproduce the sequence," he said. She dipped a quill into thick ink, crossed out line after line from a ledger copy they had made, and then fed the worst of the diagrams into a brazier. The pages flared and went black, and the sound of paper collapsing into ash filled the small room. The heat licked their faces, and they smelled scorched glue and iron. The action was concrete and irreversible. When dawn climbed higher, priory officers returned with a provisional order. The priory would supervise repairs, limit the demiurge's use, and require oversight of volunteer programs. Miriam would be held to account, and the researcher would be given conditional access to the archives as a chronicler. The volunteer would be transported to a neutral infirmary to recover under observation. The researcher walked with Miriam to the chapel door. A crowd of acolytes and townsfolk pressed against the courtyard's wall, eyes bright with rumor. The warden stood a short distance away, hands empty and jaw set. He did not speak, but he watched them with an assessment that measured future threats. The researcher and Miriam paused. The reliquary was small and heavy in her hands. He had expected a larger blaze of rhetoric. Instead came a quiet, very specific exchange. "You lied to him," the researcher, he was temporary to get him to consent. "I told him the truth in the way I thought would make him survive," Miriam answered. He looked at her. He thought of the smoldering page, the volunteer's hand, the metal arm. "We will record everything," he said. "We will not let the priory call this a technical failure again. We will name names." She nodded once. The sunrise slanted across the courtyard in a narrow band and laid a strip of light along the reliquary's metal. He could not call it hope. He could call it a plan. At the gate, a messenger waited with a sealed envelope from the distant house the acolyte had mentioned. Miriam tucked the envelope into a pocket and closed the reliquary into a locked chest for safekeeping. The researcher wrote one final, exact sentence in the field journal. The machine was active. People were treated as inputs. One ember preserved, he dated it and signed with his name and his title, occult researcher. They walked away from the chapel together under the morning light, while the priory argued behind them. The volunteers' breathing steadied with each step toward the infirmary. The reliquary remained sealed. The demiurge lay in bits on the altar, its logic interrupted, its meat and gear undone. Their choices had broken the production cycle for now. The machine's record remained in choices recorded, and in the ember tucked away, he had achieved a conclusion. He had stopped a sequence that treated human life as provisional and had forced a reckoning inside the priory. But the field journal kept him honest. The ledger still existed in part, the priory still had defenders, and the logic of replacement had been seeded for centuries. He could not claim victory, only a halt. He placed the sealed ledger into a hidden chest and set an iron plate over it to obscure the title. Miriam touched the reliquary and said, "On the next dusk, we go to the house that claims a maker. We will test their method. If they can cradle a spark, we will learn. If not, we will bury what we must and expose what we can." She looked at him. "Are you with me?" He tightened the strap on his satchel and felt the weight of the schematics there. He nodded once. Yes, they left the priory doors behind. Priory men shouted orders, and the courtyard filled with voices. The researcher had one final duty before the day ended. To write, to record, to make sure the ember's rescue and the demiurge's ruin were not reduced to rumor. He would deliver the ledger to trusted hands. He would publish carefully and avoid reckless exposure that would let the priory burn the evidence and vanish. He sealed the field journal and tucked it into his satchel next to the schematics, the burnt page, and a small strip of oilcloth that contained the reliquary key. Miriam walked beside him with steady steps. She no longer carried the air of a sole archivist guarding secrets from outsiders. She now wore the fatigue of someone who had chosen and endured. At the stone bridge leaving the priory precinct, a rider approached carrying a wax packet. He halved the distance and handed the packet to Miriam. She read it quickly and then folded it into her palm. The letter was an invitation and a threat in one. The distant house claimed knowledge and offered a meeting but demanded assurances and silence. Miriam looked at the researcher. "We will answer," she said. "We will go. But first we will secure witnesses and make sure the ledger survives. We will build allies. The priory will attempt to absorb this and label it madness unless we force them to face facts." She set her jaw. He nodded. He felt the ember's aftertaste on his palms like the faint smell of warm parchment. He had acted on suspicion and had been forced through fear into a decision that broke a machine. The ember was safe for now. The volunteer had survived a single extraction. The priory's public judgment was stalled into bureaucratic limbo. They walked toward the city, a reliquary between them. The researcher kept his hand on the strap of his satchel and his mind sorted practical tasks. Who to contact, where to hide copies, how to keep Miriam from being overwhelmed by reprisals. He listed names in his head and wrote them down later in the journal. 2 local abbots, a retired scribe, and outsider scholar in the market district who owed him a favor. The chapter closed on a concrete action. The researcher sealed the ember into the reliquary, placed the reliquary inside a locked chest, wrote the ledger's first public lines, and walked out of the priory courtyard with Miriam at his side, ready to pursue the contact from the distant house. There was no triumphant speech, no neat consolation. The work ahead was specific, dangerous, and necessary. The chapter ends with a clear physical beat. He locks the chest, writes his entry, and walks away toward the messenger's meeting at dusk.